Article was Allegory in Chestnut's Marrow of Tradition by James R. Giles and Thomas P. Lally. Now, allegory refers to a story, poem, or picture that can be interpreted to reveal a hidden meaning, typically a moral or political one. We will look at Chestnut doing this throughout his novel, but first, I'd like to introduce you to what my article says overall. Now, it starts with saying that critics agree that it is overwritten, that the Marrow of Tradition is overwritten and overplotted, and that the characters are way too stereotyped to be believable. The two critics that we specifically analyzed that say this are Robert A. Bone and Addison Gale Jr. Robert A. Bone believes that Dr. Miller and Josh Green are prototypes of two possible black responses to white oppression. He also thinks that Chestnut had the potential for an important book, but his assimilationist views led him to abandon this theme. As for Gale, he has been quoted as saying that Chestnut has come closest to creating the image of the new black citizen. He also believes that the book is way more important than what Bone claims. Gale also challenges Bone's aesthetic criticism by asserting that a major goal of black writing should be the creation of a new black consciousness. Although he is in agreement with Bone in the fact that Dr. Miller and Josh Green do represent opposite black reactions to racial injustices. Now, Chestnut uses a very interesting way of conveying his ideology. The novel's characterization results from Chestnut's thematic intent than from any artistic inadequacy. His aims of this allegory are way different from the aims of any literary realism that was common to the time. For some historical context, the use of allegorical figures to convey ideology is a common feature of protest writing. Booker T. Washington, W.E.B. Du Bois, Martin Luther King Jr., and Malcolm X have all been transformed by black writers into symbols of contrasting reactions to racial oppression. Now, despite not presenting actual historical figures, Chestnut does arrange his fictional creations in a pattern which corresponds to a very definite version of the American past. Now let's dive right into how Chestnut uses allegory within the white community. The overlying theme here is that racial progress was really just the destruction of the white aristocrat's family. For example, old Mr. Delamere had a very humane element to him that allowed the audience to realize that not all whites were bluntly racist. He would go on to save Sandy after Sandy was falsely accused of robbing and murdering Mrs. Ochiltree. However, this leads to him finding out that his son, Tom Delamere, was the killer who was dressed in blackface. This realization was way too much for him to handle, and old Mr. Delamere passed away because of the shock. As for other characters in the white community, figures like Carteret, Belmont, and McBain are able to take leadership in this novel because even though they are very evil and very racist, they do have a motivation in the novel, unlike the Delameres, who are too content. Furthermore, Ellis is a sincere character, but is rather ineffectual. For instance, he has the ability to save Sandy, but he will not turn in Tom in fear that he will lose his love, Clara. There's also three generations of spoiled, self-centered female aristocrats, as represented by Mrs. Polly Ochiltree, Mrs. Olivia Carteret, and Miss Clara Pemberton. These women are so sheltered from reality that they are totally incompetent to deal with it. Now, the last thing that Giles and Lally have to say about the allegory within the white community is that the Carteret's perpetually ill child just furthermore completes Chestnut's allegory as far as the novel's white people are concerned, because he personifies a weakened bloodline. Giles and Lally move on to their discussion about the allegory within the black community in the novel. They begin with Sandy and Aunt Jane, who they believe to be characters that are very, very anachronistic. In other words, they believe that these characters belong or are appropriate to an earlier period in time, but don't exactly fit in with the community they live in currently. Therefore, Giles and Lally claim that the audience must look towards Dr. Miller and Josh Green as characters that accurately represent the black society of this time period. Chestnut, throughout the novel, goes into detail with Dr. Miller to viably represent him as part of the talented 10th. Now, the talented 10th is a term that has designated a leadership class of African Americans in the early 20th century. It was originally publicized by W.E.B. Du Bois. Now, Gale, one of our critics, believes that Chestnut is exhibiting a selfish perversion of the talented 10th, and really doesn't know whether he wishes to uplift his people or to avoid them altogether. Therefore, Gale claims that the audience would be much more drawn towards Josh Green because he is a forceful character despite not being in the novel as much as Miller is. Giles and Lally want to emphasize that even when Carteret and Belmont and McBain go on their murdering spree, Dr. Miller still argues for moderation and against violent retaliation. This leads Gale to believe that the ideology behind Miller's character is absolutely ludicrous. Giles and Lally claim that the novel shows that Chestnut approves of neither Josh nor Miller's responses to black oppression. However, he points to Janet Miller's black separatist views as a mix of Josh and Dr. Miller. Her views really tie the two allegorical patterns of the novel into one cohesive statement. This statement is, and I quote, "It demonstrates that the death of benevolence in white society and the suicidal nature of violent black retaliation makes separatism the only course that offers a black American both dignity and a degree of physical safety." Giles and Lally are claiming that Chestnut believes that the best possible course that a black person could take in society at this time is to separate themselves from society as a whole and live their own separate life. Now, similarly to what we have studied in class, Chestnut is using a very accurate representation of society at the time. He's using direct commentary. He also uses clear historical references throughout his text. Overall, though, he's trying to get readers to realize that it was not plausible for blacks and whites to fight, as this would lead to only bloodshed. He knew the whites would not back down if it did come down to conflict, and thus wanted the black community to separate themselves for as long as they needed to stay safe and until racial issues improved. This is what Giles and Lally believe the underlying message is in this allegorically written novel by Chestnut. Now, I'd just like to point out that I have added some separate articles and journal entries to the handout that also dive into characters and structures and a lot more analysis onto what Chestnut is trying to do in the Marrow tradition. Now that does it all for me, and thank you.